Welcome to Poland Daily History with me, Nicholas Richardson. In the previous episode, we started to discuss the life of Stanisław Kot, a brilliant historian, leader of the agrarian Polish People's Party, and the man who signed the official announcement that the Polish government in exile would demand that the International Red Cross investigate who was behind the Katyn massacre during the Second World War.
In 1941 then, initially he was a Minister of Interior in the government in exile. In 1941, Adolf Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, and it reversed the alliances that had been in existence up to then. The Soviet Union had naturally taken part in the attack on Poland in 1939 together with the Nazis, but after Operation Barbarossa, when the Soviet Union needed support from the Western Allies, they had to mend the relationship with Poland. And there was an agreement, the so-called Majski-Sikorski agreement, signed between the Poles and the Soviets. After this, Mr. Kot was sent to the Soviet Union to become Poland's ambassador in the USSR. There he was naturally mostly concerned with finding all of these missing Polish military officers that had been taken POWs by the Soviet Union in 1939. Naturally, that wasn't possible since they had been all murdered in 1940 by the Soviets. But at that point, it was unknown. In 1942, he became a state secretary for the Polish forces in the Middle East, since the so-called Anders Army had been formed in the Soviet Union. But they had been allowed to, after British intervention, they had been allowed to move out of the country through the Middle East down to Jordan or British-controlled Palestine and then to Europe. It was a lot of administration necessary, so Kot spent almost a full year there. After that, he returned to Europe and took on the role as Minister of Information in the Polish government in exile. This happened in March 1943. And just a couple of weeks later, in April in 1943, it was the Germans revealed that they had found these mass graves in the Katyn forest. And Mr. Kot, he was the one who signed the communique in which the Polish government in exile stated that they wanted the International Red Cross to conduct an investigation to see who was the culprit behind this massacre. The Soviets reacted very poorly. They had reached a stage of the war when they were becoming increasingly confident that they would end up winning it. So they didn't really need this alliance with the Poles anymore, especially since they knew that they would pass through Polish territory in the next year or so. And they had their own plans on who would get to rule over Poland. And naturally, it wasn't the government in exile. So they broke off relationships with Poland. Stanisław Kot continued serving in the government in exile up until 1945, when he, together with his party leader, Stanisław Mikołajczyk, who had become the prime minister of the Polish government in exile, they were both from the same Polish People's Party, the Agrarian Party. Some of the Poles in exile, they thought it was not a good idea to try to form any kind of agreement with the communists. They didn't want to return to Poland. The Agrarian Party, however, with Stanisław Mikołajczyk, they thought that the only chance to salvage whatever could be salvaged was to enter this government of national unity that the communists were proposing. So for 2 years, between 1945 and 1947, Kot was involved in this effort. He was given a role as Poland's ambassador to Italy of this government of national unity. However, in 1947, we had falsified elections, a terror campaign against those members of the Polish People's Party who refused to submit to the communists. So Mikołajczyk escaped from Poland, so did Mr. Kot, and he ended up again back in the UK, where he spent the rest of his life. He continued writing for a few years after the war. He became the party leader of the Agrarian Party in 1955. But in 1964, he had a stroke, after which he ended up in a coma for 2 years. He managed to recover, but not completely. He was incapacitated from academic work for the rest of his life, unfortunately. And in 1975, at the age of 90, he finally passed away. So unfortunately, probably not in the circumstances that he would want to, in exile far away from his native Poland, which his entire life had in one way or another fought for, whether in his role as a representative of the government in exile, or as a political agitator and functionary of the Polish People's Party. But mostly he remains in the memory of Poland as the man who penned the communique in which Poland demanded that the International Red Cross would investigate the Katyn massacre. And of course then the reaction from the Soviets breaking off relationships and starting the process which really led to the Soviet Union taking control of Poland for, well, almost 5 decades after the war.
Indeed. Well, until 1989. Mm-hmm. Extraordinary story, yes. And amazing to think, isn't it, that these people devoted their lives to fighting for Poland. Some were lucky enough to see Poland re-emerge in 1989,
yes.
And others, of course, died during the darkest days.
Some of them were at least lucky to get out of Poland and remain in exile and not end up in some Soviet prison or some Soviet labor camp.
Even at this distance, it is still hard, I think, to fully understand the cynicism of the Soviet regime. And people who did return to Poland, of course, many of whom were executed on the flimsiest of pretexts.
Unfortunately.
Anyway, that's been fascinating. Thank you. There we have it. Adam has guided us through the life of another fascinating figure from the 20th century in Poland, a man who fought for and gave intellectual weight to the struggle for a free Poland. Alas, he didn't live to see it. But we will have more interesting characters on the next edition of Poland Daily History. So thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.